Hello and welcome to our study of Philippians. We just finished Colossians and now we're diving right in to the next book in our study of the prison epistles. Now, prison epistles are four letters of our New Testament: Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. And so when we finish Philippians, Philemon is the only one we have left. And you might think, well, one chapter letter will take us no time at all to get through. I think you're mistaken on that. There's so much history and understanding of the culture that goes into the study of Philemon. I think it'll get us for a couple of lessons. I'm wondering where we need to go from here. I know we have a long way to go because we have Philippians to get through and then Philemon, but I'm wondering where we need to go next. And so if you have any suggestions on what we should study next, maybe it's a book of the Bible you'd like to look at verse by verse like we have been. Maybe it's a theme or a topic that we find in the Bible. Maybe it's something different. Whatever you might have on your heart, you've been thinking as we've studied this, you thought, well, you know what? A study of this would be really good and it'd be beneficial for a lot of people. I hope that you'll let me know that. Email me, jsethhouston@gmail.com, or send me a message on Facebook. Get a hold of me at church, however you can, and we'll look into that. And so, like I said, today we're jumping on the joyride. We're getting into Philippians, which is one of the happiest letters in the Bible, let alone the New Testament. And it's one of those letters where when you look at the situation and the circumstances that the author is in, which is very important for us as we look at context, and then you move into how this letter is laid out and all of the different words that are being used here to represent joy and happiness and the fulfillment and hope and all of that. It really does seem like polar opposites are coming together and existing, and that Christ is the glue that binds those together. So today, as we look at context, and when we study any passage of Scripture, context is key. We have to look at context. And so every time we jump into a new book of the Bible, we're going to look at context. And so today we're going to look at the historical context of Philippi, the church at Philippi, and Paul's context a little more in detail. So let's begin by talking about the history of Philippi. Philippi stood about 10 miles inland from the Aegean Sea in the Roman province of Macedonia. And so Philippi, we're going to learn, is this huge military complex. Most people who lived there, most people who settled there, were given land grants from fighting in the Roman government. So the Roman government, the Roman military, was a really good thing to be involved in. It's a lot like the U.S. military, and I know U.S. military has its downfalls with its veterans and those who are out of service. We have a lot of homeless veterans in America today. The same was true in Rome, but not nearly to the extent. If you were a high-ranking official in the Roman military, you had it made pretty much. And so you would serve your time, get out. They would give you land from one of the provinces that you conquered, and so you're not moving back to Rome. You and your family would move to that province, to that land, and you would start farming there. You might start a business there, and you would have a retirement from your military. And so this land of Philippi is going to fulfill that. Long before the time of Paul, 420 years, something like that, in 356 BC, Philip II, who was the king of Macedonia and father of Alexander the Great, renamed the town after himself, and he enlarged it. So he conquers Philippi, and he names it Philippi after himself, after him being Philip II. Now fast forward in 186 BC, Philippi became part of the Roman Empire when Rome defeated the Persians at the Battle of Pydna. Now, what you're finding out from all of this is that Philippi seems to be in the middle of these major military battles. And the winner is going to take Philippi, and it's going to become settled by these military people. This is going to become very important, I think, for Paul when he starts writing to the Philippians, and he's going to use some terminology that they as military leaders would be very familiar with. And so Macedonia was then divided into 4 districts, and Philippi belonged to the first. Now, we fast forward then from 168 BC to 42 BC. So this is in the realm of Julius Caesar has been killed, and now you have Octavian, Antony, Lepidus, and they're all fighting Brutus and Cassius, and they fought their major battle where Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus defeat Brutus at Philippi, or just west of Philippi. And so Philippi, as we've said long before, would become a military colony. You fight your battles, you retire from the military, um, you are given a piece of land. Philippi is one of those places. And so the Philippians enjoyed an autonomous government. In other words, because they were a military situation, because they were a military settlement, a military colony, they were able to have their own government. And so they were still tied in with Rome, but kind of like with Jerusalem and Judea and Palestine in that area, they were able to have their own government as long as they paid taxes and gave homage to Rome. Well, Philippi was the same way. They didn't have to pay taxes because they were a military community. And when you retire from the military, you no longer have to pay taxes. And then they were treated as if they were citizens of the Roman Empire, as if they lived in Italy. But what about the church at Philippi? Well, Philippi was the first town in which Paul preached after he crossed the Aegean Sea from Troas and entered what we now call Europe. And so this is around AD 49. You can read about it in Acts 16. Paul goes to Philippi and he preaches there as he's entering his way into Europe. Now, the religious life of those in Philippi was marked by a very synchronistic by very synchronistic practices, including the worship of the emperor and the Egyptian gods Isis and Serapis, as well as many other deities. We really shouldn't expect anything different from the Philippians, especially them being a Roman influence and so on. When we study Rome, we often think that religion took a backseat, that it was personal power and it's all about the emperors and all that. That's really not true. Religion had a front seat in Roman life, so much so that they built these grand temples to their gods and goddesses. And when we studied Ephesians, we talked about this with the temple to Artemis or Diana, depending on if you're a Greek or a Roman. Same goddess, different name. And we talked about how they had such a devotion to their gods. In Colossians, in the 3rd chapter, in our discussion of Christian freedom, we talked a great deal about how the Colossian community was still going out and performing these ritualistic acts because it was for their benefit to keep peace with the community. And Paul says, look, you have the freedom to go out and do this, but of course Paul would also tell us if it's going to be a stumbling block to someone, don't do that. And so the church at Philippi was caught in the middle of this. They were caught in these false gods and false deities, and we're going to see that here in Philippians in our study. Now, in AD 50, the city began to have a few Jewish residents, and the first converts were Lydia, who is a Gentile businesswoman, and the Philippian jailer. Now, again, when Emperor Claudius gets in office, he's going to expel the Jews from Rome. A lot of those Jews left Rome and settled elsewhere. But going back to maybe the time period of Daniel and others, this is what we call the beginnings of the Jewish diaspora, where it's the Jewish spreading. So the Jews were captured, and when Babylon took over Jerusalem and Judea, they were captured and they were brought into Babylon. And then from Babylon, when they were set free and were allowed to go back, some stayed in Babylon, some went back to Jerusalem, others went out and settled elsewhere. And so by the time we get to AD 50, there are a few Jewish residents, perhaps enough for a synagogue, but let's remember that when Paul goes to Philippi, the first converts are not Jewish. Now, most of the time when Paul goes to a different city and starts preaching, he begins in the synagogue, and the first converts are Jewish, and then the subsequent converts then are Gentile. Lydia is a Gentile businesswoman, and she's a wealthy businesswoman. She's called a maker of purple, and so she's a wealthy businesswoman. And then you have the Philippian jailer. You recall Paul is in prison with Silas, and they're singing hymns to God at midnight. What a wonderful thing to be doing in prison. And then there's this big earthquake, and the gates fall, and the Philippian jailer thinks, oh, everyone's gone, everyone has escaped, and now my life is going to come due me because it was my responsibility to make sure they stayed in here. And so he draws his sword to kill himself, and Paul says, don't harm yourself, we're all here. And the Philippian jailer was preached to that night. They told him the gospel, and they told him that whoever believes on the Lord shall be saved. And then the very next thing we find the Philippian jailer doing is that he's being baptized for the forgiveness of his sins. And so he then becomes a Christian. He's seen the power of God, and he's seen the mercy and grace of God in Paul and in that particular situation. What a wonderful, wonderful thing. I would like to think that the Philippian jailer and Lydia are in the congregation reading this letter, and that the Philippian jailer says, oh, Paul, you're in jail again. And he says, I know that you're going to be okay because you were okay when you were in my jail. Now, we talked about Lydia a little bit. She was a dealer of purple cloth and was a proselyte to Judaism, according to Acts chapter 16 and verse 14. Now, a proselyte is a Gentile person who has renounced paganism and has become, for all intents and purposes, a Jew. If you're a male proselyte, you're circumcised. If you're a proselyte, you obey the food laws. You try to keep to the law. You go to the synagogue. You say the Shema. You recite the prayers. All these things that a good Jew would do. Now, this is different from Cornelius, who in Acts chapter 10 is called a God-fearer. He believes in the God of the Jews, and he prays to the God of the Jews, but he's likely not circumcised and doesn't follow the food laws and things like that. And so it seems that she probably converted to Judaism, since her name is a Gentile name, when living at Thyatira, and brought her faith with her to Philippi. And the church, because she was wealthy, the church eventually met in her home at first. We find out in Acts 16 and verse 15. Again, house churches, we talked about this with Colossians, and we will especially a lot with Philemon. But house churches were where people met. I have a problem, though, with people who say, well, we must meet in house churches today because that's the example of the first century. Well, that is the example of the first century, but they didn't have anywhere else to meet. And the house churches were homes that were owned by the wealthy individuals of the community. Of course, Lydia is an example. Philemon and Apphia are examples. In Paul's letter to Philemon, they have a house church. There are other house churches in Rome and in Colossae. And so they didn't have anywhere else to meet. And by the way, when we refer to a house church or a church meeting in the home, it probably wasn't that they all went up into the living quarters. Now, in Acts 20, where Paul is preaching in an apartment, and Eutychus, as you recall, is the young man who falls asleep and falls out of the window, he is on that second or third story of the building because he falls out the window and kills himself. Now, the way these houses were normally structured is you have an apartment on top, and then the bottom floor is your business. And so you walk in through the bottom floor to the business, through the shop or whatever you're selling, and then you go upstairs to your living quarters. And so it could be that Lydia had a home where her business was on the ground floor, her selling of purple garments, and then you walk upstairs to her home. And so it's not entirely true that the early church only met in houses like we think of today as we go to our place of residence. Most of the early church would have met in businesses and business locations. Well, let's talk about the authorship of Philippians. Who wrote the letter? Of course, Paul claims to have written the letter in Philippians 1:1 and references to his acquaintances, events in his life, and a way of thinking point him as the writer. And of course, in today's world, we have to talk about these things because what we call liberal scholarship or liberal criticism of the Bible would say that even though the Bible claims to have been written by so-and-so, it probably wasn't. And here are the reasons why. Well, I don't think you can really get around this with Philippians because three main things. Number one, Paul himself says he wrote it. Of course, someone else could have written it claiming to be Paul, but there's too many references to his acquaintances there that we know Paul had association with while he was traveling and on his missionary trips in the book of Acts and elsewhere. And of course, we find that Paul is a prisoner at the time of writing. You may want to see chapter 1, verse 7, verse 13, and verse 16, where Paul references his imprisonment. He also references the palace guard. Now, some would say that because he talks about this palace guard, that he has to be imprisoned in Rome at this time, which would put him later in his life and in his ministry. Now we can go about this two ways. Way number one is we can couple Philippians with 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, where Paul is in prison in Rome, and he's writing to them, kind of leaving his last will and testament before he dies, and we may couple that here. However, others have argued for a Caesarean imprisonment. Some have argued for an Ephesian imprisonment. I'm one of those who argue for an Ephesian imprisonment. And I think that we can't couple Philippians with 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus because Paul mentions in chapter 1 that he's really stuck between a rock and a hard place. He says, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. You need me to stay alive. You need me to lead. You need my encouragement. But I really want to depart and be with the Lord, is what Paul says. And so it seems, however, in the letter of Philippians, as he moves on, that Paul expects that he's going to be let go, that he's going to bust out of jail, or that he's going to be released. And so I think that with the flow of the prison epistles, Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon, that Philippians is one of the early ones that he writes. He expects he's going to go to trial and be set free. And then he writes Ephesians and Colossians during the middle of his imprisonment to encourage and continue on the teaching of the church. And then Paul's going to write Philemon as his last letter because Paul tells Philemon, prepare for me a guest room. I'm coming to you, prepare for me a guest room. And so whatever your theory on that is, you're welcome to. The main point is Paul's in jail. Now, why does Paul write the letter? When you read Philippians, and I hope that you will, because today we're only going to go through the context of Philippians. So I hope that between now and our next video, you will go through and you will read Philippians from chapter 1, verse 1, all the way to the very end. Don't stop. Ignore the headings in your Bible. Ignore the chapters and verse divisions, and just read it. And read it a few times. Why write the letter? Well, I know we like to go to passages like Philippians 4:13 or Philippians 2 and these beautiful passages about God strengthening us and having humility and I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And those are well and good things. The main point of this letter, though, is that Paul is in jail, but he's trying to reassure the Philippian congregation that what they're doing is right. Now, you imagine yourself moving into this movement, and you're seeing all the leaders of your movement either die or be arrested. What are you going to think? You're going to think, man, I don't need to be involved in this movement anymore. But Paul is encouraging them. He's writing to them saying the mission of the gospel is going, and it's doing everything that it needs to do. And so a man by the name of Epaphroditus, or Epaphras, who we studied about in Colossians, they had sent Epaphroditus with a gift to Paul, which would be a monetary gift, and to minister to his needs in prison. Now, Epaphroditus had become extremely sick to the point of death, but he had recovered, and he's going to be the letter carrier to send this letter back to the Philippians. And so Paul built up Epaphroditus in the eyes of his readers, which suggests that they may not have appreciated him adequately for some reason. Now, Epaphroditus may have been a slave in the Philippian in a Philippian context. He may have been looked at as a kind of a lowly person, but nonetheless, they sent him with this monetary gift, and Paul, really, as a missionary, is writing this letter to thank the Philippians for their gift, to announce that Timothy is going to come visit them, and a guy by the name of Robert Lightner suggests that the book might even be called a thank you note to the saints in Philippi for their generous gift. And I really like what Lightner has to say about this. He says, they've sent him this gift, and Paul needs to write them a thank you note so that they'll keep sending money. We in the Lord's church have missionaries who come and talk about their missionary journeys and about the churches that they're planting and the churches that they're growing in these foreign soils. And when they come, they give us the report, but really they're asking for more money. And I think that's what Paul's doing here. And I'm not saying this isn't inspired scripture. It certainly is. I'm not saying that there's nothing we can't learn from it. There certainly is. But Paul is taking this And he is running with it. You gave me this great gift. You sent me these good people to take care of me, and they got sick and I took care of them. You know what? If you want to do it again, by all means. And I think Paul lays it on a little thick here in Philippians. Again, not saying it's not inspired, just saying Paul, as the human author, he has some ulterior motives here besides just encouragement. He's, I think, wanting some more money. And so, without a doubt, all of Paul's epistles, of all of Paul's epistles, Philippians is the most consistently positive and personal. Now, I would say that Philemon is the most personal, but this Philippians is the most consistently personal and positive. It reflects Paul's joyful spirit, and on one particular exposition of Philippians, stresses the importance of living joyfully in spite of the circumstances. And so I think this is really the main thesis of Paul's letter. Even though I think he's writing to get more money, Paul's saying, look, I know how to live with and without. And I'm here in prison, but I have joy because I have the Spirit. And one of the elements of the fruit of the Spirit is joy. And if we're in Christ, we can have joy even in the hardest of circumstances. Now, notice what Paul doesn't do. Paul does not rebuke this church sharply, and he doesn't refer to any major problems there. Now, he does refer to two feuding women in the church, but he doesn't elaborate on that. He just says, look, y'all need to get along. But the main purpose of the letter is a joyful letter, and that's why I've entitled our study of Philippians, Joyride. This really is a joyride, and we get to see how even in the hardest of circumstances, and boy, for year 2020 as being one of the most difficult years of my lifetime, perhaps of yours as well, we could use some joy, and we could really use an occasion to understand how we as Christians can have joy and hope in Jesus Christ. Well, I look forward to getting into chapter 1 with you next week. I hope that you are gearing up for this, and I hope that you will read on in Philippians. Again, ignore chapter and verse divisions. Read Philippians as a letter from a man in prison to a good congregation who's helped him out. And again, if you have suggestions for where we need to go next after we finish our study of the prison epistles, I hope that you will let me know that, and I'll be happy to entertain any ideas. God bless you. I hope you have a great week and a great day.